Welcome, AP Psychology students. Mr. Dowell here. We're going to be looking at our next unit, which is Unit 11, which is about intelligence and testing. So let's get to it. Keep these short and sweet. A few things about this unit. Difficulty level, I'd say it's pretty average. There's a few topics that give people a little bit of trouble, but it's really not too bad. There are some names to know, which is a little bit different from some units. So there's some names you want to know what the research says and how that plays in. And some of the terms to watch out in this unit when we get to validity and reliability and standardization, it gets a little bit dry. People start to, kind of glaze over a little bit, but we'll get you through it. So we're going to start with Module 60 today, which is more or less an introduction to intelligence. So we're going to look at being able to define intelligence and then looking at some of the different theories of intelligence. Those will be our main focuses today. We kind of do this in class, which we can't do exactly the same thing here, but what I generally do is have someone kind of, turn to someone nearby and just kind of talk through if you had to create a working definition of intelligence. So if you were going to put a definition on intelligence, what would you call it? So take a second, pause, just think to yourself for 30, 45 seconds and see what you come up with. You'll see here it says, is Stephen Wiltshire intelligent? I'm going to post a video of this gentleman on Moodle right below this video, and so I would just say at some point, watch this short clip and then ask yourself, does he fit the definition of intelligence? The big thing I would want you to get is that intelligence is not really a thing. It's something that we try to define. We try to create some concrete meaning behind it, which is a process known as reification, but really it's an abstract idea. And so you see here, psychologists cannot really agree. If you look at 10 different psych books, there's going to be slightly different definitions of those. But generally in our discussions in class, after we talk about our own personal definitions, some themes arise. One, the ability to learn from experience. So it's not necessarily knowing a lot of stuff, although that would probably help, but it's learning from experience, how to solve problems, and then being able to use what we know to adapt to new situations. So you do have to know some things, but it's more or less taking what you know and being able to use it in different ways. And kind of, if you're put into a new situation, being able to adapt to that situation. But the point is intelligence depends on the context, right? So different cultures would have different definitions for what intelligence is. So think about what we prize here in Johnston, Iowa, versus maybe you have people living in a third world country, or people living in an inner city. We're not saying one of those is better than the other, they're just different. So intelligence depends on the situation. And then what we're going to look at with these theories is intelligence one thing? Is it many things? And that's really what these theories revolve around. So the first theory, it's called Charles Spearman's G factor. So Charles Spearman was a psychologist back in the 1920s, also a statistician, and he would give these intelligence tests that tested many different capabilities, cognitive capabilities. And what he found was that people that scored well on one of these tests, for example, like mathematical computation or whatever, also tended to do well on other tests, not only math, but also things like reading and all those kind of things. And so he used what was called factor analysis, which you don't really need to know terribly in detail, but understand it's a statistical procedure that allows scientists to correlate how different test items relate to one another. So you can see if people score well in one factor, do they also score well in another factor? If you want to know more, I'll have a video posted in this lesson if you want to dig a little bit deeper, but that's for Psych 101, we're doing okay. But again, he generally found that all of these scores correlated for most people, so that led him to come up with what he called the G factor. And G meaning general intelligence. So he is basically saying that intelligence is one thing. You have a general cognitive ability. We don't really like to think of it like this because we like to think about how people can be intelligent in many ways. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I feel like we're more likely to accept this when it comes to physical capabilities. I think we, to some degree, all realize that some people are more athletic than other people. There are some people that have to work really hard to be good at a sport. Others just kind of naturally have that athletic ability, whether it's the size, the speed, the ability to jump, the ability to, like, some people are just naturally good. And then what we oftentimes find with athletic ability is that people who are fast runners also tend to be able to jump high, and they also tend to have good hand-eye coordination. So those things tend to correlate, and believe it or not, there actually does seem to be a G factor to some extent, that people that score well in one cognitive area also tend to score well in other areas. So it's the same kind of idea with athleticism, but also with kind of traditional, what we think of as cognitive abilities. Again, I kind of talked about factor analysis and what that is. You can kind of read the slide there, but it's basically what I talked about, how different questions would measure the same capabilities, and if you scored well in one area, would you also score well in another? And that's how Spearman came up with his conclusions. The next one is the other end of the spectrum, Howard Gardner. That is a picture of him above. He's an interesting guy. I actually got a chance to, I wouldn't say I met him, but I saw him at a conference, and he's interesting. But he, instead of believing in the G factor, he believes in multiple intelligences. So other end of the spectrum, he says there's 8. Actually, I think now there's a 9th one. But the basic premise is that there's multiple intelligences, and that all of us have varying degrees of each of these, but we have some that are more dominant. Now, while there is research to support G factor, we can't ignore some things when it comes to multiple intelligence. For example, there's a condition known as savant syndrome. You're going to see that with the Stephen Wiltshire video, but the basic premise is you have some people who very mediocre, if not below average in many capabilities, but they have this island of brilliance. So they have this one thing that they can do really, really well. And that's called being a savant. We're talking about extremely well, by the way. And so that would kind of lend some credence to the idea of multiple intelligence, that you're not very good at some things, but you're really good at something else. We do know with research that different areas of the brain tend to be in charge of different cognitive tasks. That would, again, also support multiple intelligences. So I don't think the two have to necessarily be mutually exclusive, being multiple intelligences and G factor. This slide just kind of lists them out briefly. Interpersonal is like being able to get along with people, very good people person. Intrapersonal is knowing yourself very well, which is an underrated trait, knowing your strengths, knowing your weaknesses, staying within yourself. Linguistic, being word smart, reading, writing, those kind of things. Logical, mathematics. These are pretty self-explanatory. Music smarts, bodily kinesthetic, so people who are good, athletic, know how to use their body. Spatial awareness and or like being artistic. And then nature smart, which is kind of hard to describe, but the way that they describe it is just like being very intuitive about how to use things in nature, like to live off the land. I always think about the guy, he had a show a couple of years ago, it was like Bear Grylls, and he would like just live off the land, and he would fit the prototype for nature smart. You're not going to necessarily need to memorize all these in a list, but again, they're pretty self-explanatory. Just another slide there. The third one is kind of in the middle. It's Sternberg's triarchic theory of intelligence, tri meaning 3. So we have the analytic intelligence, which is basically what we call school smarts. We have creative intelligence, so being able to be creative. Think about writers, artists, those kind of things. And then we have this third one, which is kind of tough, practical intelligence. I mean, we talked about how intelligence is difficult enough to define. But when you think about having practical intelligence, having street smarts, that is a tough one to do. Like, how do you know if someone is street smart? The key thing here is they can take what they know. It's an ability, and they can apply it to real world situations. You might have some people who, they can read a textbook and regurgitate it back to you, but if someone has the practical intelligence, they can use what they've learned. So, analytic is like, I read the chapter on operant conditioning and I can recite it back to you. Practical intelligence is like, hey, I'm going to use this to like train my brother, and they're good at it. So, they're all useful. One criticism of this one is that a lot of times there's a high correlation between these. And so critics are saying, if there's a high correlation, isn't that just G? Like, are they really that different if they correlate that much? So, I'll let you make your own decisions and decide what you think. But this is, kind of the third one, that there's the analytic, the creative, and the practical. And again, these would be considered abilities, not like I just know a lot of stuff. It's I know things, but then I use that information in novel ways. Just another slide there. Again, who is right? The big thing, understand that G does seem to exist, and G is a predictor of success at the highest levels, meaning people who get into like prestigious colleges and those kind of things, and people with high levels of G tend to have higher salaries than average and have more prestigious jobs, but not all the time. Not all the time. What's interesting though is this term here, grit. You've probably heard this before, but grit seems to be a more powerful predictor of long-term success. And how do we define grit? And you're going to see a TED Talk below in this lesson that I want you to watch. It's like 5-6 minutes, and we'll talk about it. Basically, passion, perseverance, being conscientious, detail-oriented, having energy in what you're doing. They've actually found, when they've tracked people that have these traits tend to it predicts long-term success more than IQ, more than just G. So, if you're someone who's like, well, I have to work hard at things, like in school, that's actually okay, because the people that work really hard, things tend to work out for them. I know a lot of students who were really, 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 really bright, high levels of G, but just had a hard time putting it together. But generally those people who they work really hard and maybe they have to work really hard for their B or whatever, those people tend to work, it tends to work out okay for them because they've learned those work habits, and whatever they end up doing, they put their mind to it and they do really well. So think of it like intelligence gives you the opportunity, but grit actually tends to make the difference. If you want to be an expert at something, you got to have the grit. And they call it the 10-year rule. Like, to become an expert at something, it takes about 10 years of, practice to become an expert. So, that overnight success usually took about 10 years. And then there's emotional intelligence, which would kind of be like the interpersonal, intrapersonal intelligence in Gardner, but the ability to kind of perceive emotions in other people, understand others' emotions, where they're coming from, also understanding your own emotions, being able to use them. Because I feel this way, maybe I can relate to somebody, and also regulating emotions. There's always times where like, oh man, I want to yell at this person, but they don't. You regulate. Okay, this is not an appropriate time to act like this, so I'm not going to do it. You can read that slide. That's really all I would say about it anyway. There is a correlation between brain size and intelligence, and there actually is a correlation between how fast someone's brain processes information and IQ. I am going to hit my 15-minute limit, so I'm going to stop myself. Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you soon.